A Passage to India. Novel by E.M. Forster. Chapter 5. The bridge party was not a success. At least it was not what Mrs. Moore and Miss Quested were accustomed to consider a successful party. They arrived early, since it was given in their honor. But most of the Indian guests had arrived even earlier, and stood massed at the farther side of the tennis lawns, doing nothing. "It is only just 5, said Mrs. Turton. "My husband will be up from his office in a moment and start the thing. I have no idea what we have to do. It's the first time we've ever given a party like this at the club. Mr. Heaslop, when I'm dead and gone, will you give parties like this? It's enough to make the old type of Burra Sahib turn in his grave." Ronny laughed deferentially. "You wanted something not picturesque and we've provided it," he remarked to Miss Quested. "What do you think of the Aryan brother in a toppy and spats?" Neither she nor his mother answered. They were gazing rather sadly over the tennis lawn. No, it was not picturesque. The East, abandoning its secular magnificence, was descending into a valley whose farther side no man can see. The great point to remember is that no one who's here matters. Those who matter don't come. Isn't that so, Mrs. Turton? "Absolutely true," said the great lady, leaning back. She was saving herself up, as she called it, not for anything that would happen that afternoon or even that week, but for some vague future occasion when a high official might come along and tax her social strength. Most of her public appearances were marked by this air of reserve. Assured of her approbation, Ronny continued, "The educated Indians will be no good to us if there's a row. It's simply not worthwhile conciliating them, that's why they don't matter. Most of the people you see are seditious at heart, and the rest LD run squealing. The cultivator, he's another story. The Patan, he's a man if you like. But these people, don't imagine they're India." He pointed to the dusky line beyond the court, and here and there it flashed a pince-nez or shuffled a shoe. As if aware that he was despising it. European costume had lighted like a leprosy. Few had yielded entirely, but none were untouched. There was a silence when he had finished speaking. On both sides of the court, at least, more ladies joined the English group, but their words seemed to die as soon as uttered. Some kites hovered overhead, impartial. Over the kites passed the mass of a vulture, and with an impartiality exceeding all, the sky, not deeply colored but translucent, poured light from its whole circumference. It seemed unlikely that the series stopped here. Beyond the sky must not there be something that overarches all the skies, more impartial even than they? Beyond which again? They spoke of Cousin Kate. They had tried to reproduce their own attitude to life upon the stage, and to dress up as the middle-class English people they actually were. Next year they would do Quality Street or the Yeoman of the Guard. Save for this annual incursion, they left literature alone. The men had no time for it, the women did nothing that they could not share with the men. Their ignorance of the arts was notable, and they lost no opportunity of proclaiming it to one another. It was the public school attitude, flourishing more vigorously than it can yet hope to do in England. If Indians were shop, the arts were bad form. And Ronny had repressed his mother when she inquired after his viola. A viola was almost a demerit, and certainly not the sort of instrument one mentioned in public. She noticed now how tolerant and conventional his judgments had become. When they had seen Cousin Kate in London together in the past, he had scorned it. Now he pretended that it was a good play, in order to hurt nobody's feelings. An unkind notice had appeared in the local paper. The sort of thing no white man could have written, as Mrs. Leslie said. The play was praised, to be sure, and so were the stage management and the performance as a whole, but the notice contained the following sentence. Miss Derrick, though she charmingly looked her part, lacked the necessary experience, and occasionally forgot her words. This tiny breath of genuine criticism had given deep offense, not indeed to Miss Derrick, who was as hard as nails, but to her friends. Miss Derrick did not belong to Chandrapur. She was stopping for a fortnight with the McBrides, the police people, and she had been so good as to fill up a gap in the cast at the last moment. A nice impression of local hospitality she would carry away with her. "To work, Mary, to work," cried the collector, touching his wife on the shoulder with a switch. Mrs. Turton got up awkwardly. "What do you want me to do?" "Oh, those Purdah women. I never thought any would come." "Oh dear." A little group of Indian ladies had been gathering in a third quarter of the grounds, near a rustic summer house in which the more timid of them had already taken refuge. The rest stood with their backs to the company and their faces pressed into a bank of shrubs. At a little distance stood their male relatives, watching the venture. The sight was significant, an island bared by the turning tide, and bound to grow. "I consider they ought to come over to me." "Come along, Mary, get it over." "I refuse to shake hands with any of the men, unless it has to be the Nawab Bahadur." "Whom have we so far?" He glanced along the line. "H.M. Much as one expected. We know why he's here, I think, over that contract, and he wants to get the right side of me for Moharam. And he's the astrologer who wants to dodge the municipal building regulations, and he's that Parsi, and he's, hullo. There he goes, smash into our hollyhocks. Pulled the left train when he meant the right. All as usual. They ought never to have been allowed to drive in, it's so bad for them," said Mrs. Turton, who had at last begun her progress to the summer house, accompanied by Mrs. Moore, Miss Quested, and a terrier. "Why they come at all I don't know. They hate it as much as we do. Talk to Mrs. McBride. Her husband made her give Purdah parties until she struck." "This isn't a Purdah party," corrected Miss Quested. "Oh, really?" was the haughty rejoinder. "Do kindly tell us who these ladies are," asked Mrs. Moore. "You're superior to them, anyway. Don't forget that. You're superior to everyone in India except one or two of the Ranis, and they're on an equality." Advancing, she shook hands with the group and said a few words of welcome in Urdu. She had learnt the lingo, but only to speak to her servants, so she knew none of the politer forms and of the verbs only the imperative mood. As soon as her speech was over, she inquired of her companions, "Is that what you wanted? Please tell these ladies that I wish we could speak their language, but we have only just come to their country." "Perhaps we speak yours a little," one of the ladies said. "Why, fancy, she understands," said Mrs. Turton. "Eastbourne, Piccadilly, High Park Corner," said another of the ladies. "Oh yes, they're English speaking. But now we can talk, how delightful," cried Adela, her face lighting up. "She knows Paris also," called one of the onlookers. "They pass Paris on the way, no doubt," said Mrs. Turton, as if she was describing the movements of migratory birds. Her manner had grown more distant since she had discovered that some of the group was westernized, and might apply her own standards to her. "The shorter lady, she is my wife, she is Mrs. Bhattacharya," the onlooker explained. "The taller lady, she is my sister, she is Mrs. Das." The shorter and the taller ladies both adjusted their saris, and smiled. There was a curious uncertainty about their gestures, as if they sought for a new formula which neither East nor West could provide. When Mrs. Bhattacharya's husband spoke, she turned away from him, but she did not mind seeing the other men. Indeed, all the ladies were uncertain. Cowering, recovering, giggling, making tiny gestures of atonement or despair at all that was said, and alternately fondling the terrier or shrinking from him. Miss Quested now had her desired opportunity. Friendly Indians were before her, and she tried to make them talk, but she failed. She strove in vain against the echoing walls of their civility. Whatever she said produced a murmur of deprecation, varying into a murmur of concern when she dropped her pocket handkerchief. She tried doing nothing, to see what that produced, and they too did nothing. Mrs. Moore was equally unsuccessful. Mrs. Turton waited for them with a detached expression. She had known what nonsense it all was from the first. When they took their leave, Mrs. Moore had an impulse, and said to Mrs. Bhattacharya, whose face she liked, "I wonder whether you would allow us to call on you some day." "When?" she replied, inclining charmingly. "Whenever is convenient. All days are convenient." Thursday. Most certainly. We shall enjoy it greatly, it would be a real pleasure. What about the time? All hours. Tell us which you would prefer. We're quite strangers to your country, we don't know when you have visitors, said Miss Quested. Mrs. Bhattacharya seemed not to know either. Her gesture implied that she had known, since Thursdays began, that English ladies would come to see her on one of them, and so always stayed in. Everything pleased her, nothing surprised. She added, we leave for Calcutta today. Oh, do you? Said Adela, not at first seeing the implication. Then she cried, oh, but if you do we shall find you gone. Mrs. Bhattacharya did not dispute it. But her husband called from the distance, yes, yes, you come to us Thursday. But you'll be in Calcutta. No, no, we shall not. He said something swiftly to his wife in Bengali. We expect you Thursday. Thursday, the woman echoed. You can't have done such a dreadful thing as to put off going for our sake, exclaimed Mrs. Moore. No, of course not, we are not such people. He was laughing. I believe that you have. Oh, please, it distresses me beyond words. Everyone was laughing now, but with no suggestion that they had blundered. A shapeless discussion occurred, during which Mrs. Turton retired, smiling to herself. The upshot was that they were to come Thursday. But early in the morning, so as to wreck the Bhattacharya plans as little as possible, and Mr. Bhattacharya would send his carriage to fetch them, with servants to point out the way. Did he know where they lived? Yes, of course he knew everything. And he laughed again. They left among a flutter of compliments and smiles, and three ladies, who had hitherto taken no part in the reception, suddenly shot out of the summer house like exquisitely coloured swallows, and salimed them. Meanwhile the collector had been going his rounds. He made pleasant remarks and a few jokes, which were applauded lustily, but he knew something to the discredit of nearly every one of his guests, and was consequently perfunctory. When they had not cheated, it was bang, women, or worse, and even the desirables wanted to get something out of him. He believed that a bridge party did good rather than harm, or he would not have given one. But he was under no illusions, and at the proper moment he retired to the English side of the lawn. The impressions he left behind him were various. Many of the guests, especially the humbler and less anglicized, were genuinely grateful. To be addressed by so high an official was a permanent asset. They did not mind how long they stood, or how little happened, and when 7 o'clock struck, they had to be turned out. Others were grateful with more intelligence. The Nawab Bahadur, indifferent for himself and for the distinction with which he was greeted, was moved by the mere kindness that must have prompted the invitation. He knew the difficulties. Hamidullah also thought that the collector had played up well. But others, such as Mahmud Ali, were cynical. They were firmly convinced that Turton had been made to give the party by his official superiors and was all the time consumed with impotent rage, and they infected some who were inclined to a healthier view. Yet even Mahmud Ali was glad he had come. Shrines are fascinating, especially when rarely opened, and it amused him to note the ritual of the English club, and to caricature it afterwards to his friends. After Mr. Turton, the official who did his duty best was Mr. Fielding, the principal of the little government college. He knew little of the district and less against the inhabitants, so he was in a less cynical state of mind. Athletic and cheerful, he romped about, making numerous mistakes which the parents of his pupils tried to cover up. For he was popular among them. When the moment for refreshments came, he did not move back to the English side, but burnt his mouth with grum. He talked to anyone and he ate anything. Amid much that was alien, he learnt that the two new ladies from England had been a great success, and that their politeness in wishing to be Mrs. Bhattacharya's guests had pleased not only her but all Indians who heard of it. It pleased Mr. Fielding also. He scarcely knew the two new ladies, still he decided to tell them what pleasure they had given by their friendliness. He found the younger of them alone. She was looking through a nick in the cactus hedge at the distant Marabai hills, which had crept near, as was their custom at sunset, if the sunset had lasted long enough. They would have reached the town, but it was swift, being tropical. He gave her his information, and she was so much pleased and thanked him so heartily that he asked her and the other lady to tea. "He'd like to come very much indeed, and so would Mrs. Moore, I know. I'm rather a hermit, you know. Much the best thing to be in this place. Owing to my work and so on, I don't get up much to the club." I know, and we never get down from it. I envy you being with Indians. Do you care to meet one or two?" "Very, very much indeed, it's what I long for. This party today makes me so angry and miserable. I think my countrymen out here must be mad. Fancy inviting guests and not treating them properly. You and Mr. Turton and perhaps Mr. McBride are the only people who showed any common politeness. The rest make me perfectly ashamed, and it's got worse and worse." It had. The Englishmen had intended to play up better, but had been prevented from doing so by their womenfolk, whom they had to attend, provide with tea, advise about dogs, etc. When tennis began, the barrier grew impenetrable. It had been hoped to have some sets between East and West, but this was forgotten, and the courts were monopolized by the usual club couples. Fielding resented it too, but did not say so to the girl, for he found something theoretical in her outburst. Did she care about Indian music? He inquired. There was an old professor down at the college, who sang. "Oh, just what we wanted to hear. And do you know Dr. Aziz?" "I know all about him. I don't know him. Would you like him asked too?" "Mrs. Moore says he is so nice." "Very well, Miss Quested. Will Thursday suit you?" "Indeed it will, and that morning we go to this Indian lady's. All the nice things are coming Thursday. I won't ask the city magistrate to bring you. I know he'll be busy at that time." "Yes, Ronny is always hard-worked," she replied, contemplating the hills. How lovely they suddenly were. But she couldn't touch them. In front, like a shutter, fell a vision of her married life. She and Ronny would look into the club like this every evening, then drive home to dress. They would see the Leslies and the Callenders and the Turtons and the Burtons, and invite them and be invited by them, while the true India slid by unnoticed. Color would remain, the pageant of birds in the early morning, brown bodies, white turbans, idols whose flesh was scarlet or blue. And movement would remain as long as there were crowds in the bazaar and bathers in the tanks. Perched up on the seat of a dog cart, she would see them. But the force that lies behind color and movement would escape her even more effectually than it did now. She would see India always as a frieze, never as a spirit, and she assumed that it was a spirit of which Mrs. Moore had had a glimpse. And sure enough they did drive away from the club in a few minutes, and they did dress, and to dinner came Miss Derrick and the McBrides, and the menu was, julienne soup full of bullety bottled peas, pseudo cottage bread, fish full of branching bones, pretending to be plaice, more bottled peas with the cutlets, trifle, sardines on toast. The menu of Anglo-India. A dish might be added or subtracted as one rose or fell in the official scale, the peas might rattle less or more, the sardines and the vermouth be imported by a different firm. But the tradition remained, the food of exiles, cooked by servants who did not understand it. Adela thought of the young men and women who had come out before her, P&O after P&O, and had been set down to the same food and the same ideas, and been snubbed in the same good-humored way until they kept to the accredited themes and began to snub others. I should never get like that, she thought, for she was young herself. All the same she knew that she had come up against something that was both insidious and tough, and against which she needed allies. She must gather around her at Chandrapur a few people who felt as she did, and she was glad to have met Mr. Fielding and the Indian lady with the unpronounceable name. Here at all events was a nucleus, she should know much better where she stood in the course of the next 2 days. Miss Derrick, she companioned a Maharani in a remote native state. She was genial and gay and made them all laugh about her leave, which she had taken because she felt she deserved it, not because the Maharani said she might go. Now she wanted to take the Maharaja's motorcar as well. It had gone to a chief's conference at Delhi, and she had a great scheme for burgling it at the junction as it came back in the train. She was also very funny about the bridge party. Indeed, she regarded the entire peninsula as a comic opera. If one couldn't see the laughable side of these people, one LD be done for, said Miss Derrick. Mrs. McBride, it was she who had been the nurse, ceased not to exclaim, "Oh, Nancy, how topping! Oh, Nancy, how killing! I wish I could look at things like that." Mr. McBride did not speak much, he seemed nice. When the guests had gone, and Adela gone to bed, there was another interview between mother and son. He wanted her advice and support, while resenting interference. "Does Adela talk to you much?" he began. "I'm so driven with work, I don't see her as much as I hoped, but I hope she finds things comfortable. Adela and I talk mostly about India. Dear, since you mention it, you're quite right, you ought to be more alone with her than you are." "Yes, perhaps, but then people gossip." "Well, they must gossip sometime. Let them gossip. People are so odd out here, and it's not like home, one's always facing the footlights, as the Burra Sahib said. Take a silly little example, when Adela went out to the boundary of the club compound, and Fielding followed her. I saw Mrs. Calendar notice it. They notice everything, until they're perfectly sure you're their sort. I don't think Adele'll ever be quite their sort, she's much too individual." "I know, that's so remarkable about her," he said thoughtfully. Mrs. Moore thought him rather absurd. Accustomed to the privacy of London, she could not realize that India, seemingly so mysterious, contains none, and that consequently the conventions have greater force. "I suppose nothing's on her mind," he continued. Ask her yourself, my dear boy. Probably she's heard tales of the heat, but of course I should pack her off to the hills every April. I'm not one to keep a wife grilling in the plains." "Oh, it wouldn't be the weather. There's nothing in India but the weather, my dear mother, it's the alpha and omega of the whole affair." "Yes, as Mr. McBride was saying, but it's much more the Anglo-Indians themselves who are likely to get on Adela's nerves. She doesn't think they behave pleasantly to Indians, you see." "What did I tell you?" he exclaimed, losing his gentle manner. "I knew it last week. Oh, how like a woman to worry over a side issue." She forgot about Adela in her surprise. "A side issue, a side issue?" she repeated. "How can it be that? We're not out here for the purpose of behaving pleasantly." "What do you mean?" "What I say. We're out here to do justice and keep the peace. Them's my sentiments. India isn't a drawing room." "Your sentiments are those of a god," she said quietly, but it was his manner rather than his sentiments that annoyed her. Trying to recover his temper, he said, "India likes gods. And Englishmen like posing as gods. There's no point in all this. Here we are, and we're going to stop, and the country's got to put up with us, gods or no gods. Oh, look here," he broke out, rather pathetically, "what do you and Adela want me to do? Go against my class, against all the people I respect and admire out here? Lose such power as I have for doing good in this country because my behavior isn't pleasant? You neither of you understand what work is, or you LD never talk such eyewash. I hate talking like this, but one must occasionally. It's morbidly sensitive to go on as Adela and you do. I noticed you both at the club today, after the Burra Sahib had been at all that trouble to amuse you. I am out here to work, mind, to hold this wretched country by force. I'm not a missionary or a Labour member or a vague sentimental sympathetic literary man. I'm just a servant of the government. It's the profession you wanted me to choose myself, and that's that. We're not pleasant in India, and we don't intend to be pleasant. We've something more important to do." He spoke sincerely. Every day he worked hard in the court trying to decide which of two untrue accounts was the less untrue, trying to dispense justice fearlessly, to protect the weak against the less weak, the incoherent against the plausible. Surrounded by lies and flattery, That morning he had convicted a railway clerk of overcharging pilgrims for their tickets, and a Pathan of attempted rape. He expected no gratitude, no recognition for this, and both clerk and Pathan might appeal, bribe their witnesses more effectually in the interval, and get their sentences reversed. It was his duty. But he did expect sympathy from his own people, and except from newcomers he obtained it. He did think he ought not to be worried about bridge parties when the day's work was over and he wanted to play tennis with his equals or rest his legs upon a long chair. He spoke sincerely, but she could have wished with less gusto. How Ronny revelled in the drawbacks of his situation. How he did rub it in that he was not in India to behave pleasantly, and derived positive satisfaction therefrom. He reminded her of his public school days. The traces of young man humanitarianism had sloughed off. And he talked like an intelligent and embittered boy. His words without his voice might have impressed her, but when she heard the self-satisfied lilt of them, when she saw the mouth moving so complacently and competently beneath the little red nose, she felt, quite illogically, that this was not the last word on India. One touch of regret, not the canny substitute but the true regret from the heart, would have made him a different man, and the British Empire a different institution. "I'm going to argue, and indeed dictate," she said, clinking her rings. "The English are out here to be pleasant." "How do you make that out, mother?" he asked, speaking gently again. For he was ashamed of his irritability. "Because India is part of the earth. And God has put us on the earth in order to be pleasant to each other. God is love." She hesitated, seeing how much he disliked the argument, but something made her go on. "God has put us on earth to love our neighbors and to show it, and He is omnipresent, even in India, to see how we are succeeding." He looked gloomy, and a little anxious. He knew this religious strain in her, and that it was a symptom of bad health. There had been much of it when his stepfather died. He thought, "She is certainly aging, and I ought not to be vexed with anything she says." The desire to behave pleasantly satisfies God. The sincere if impotent desire wins His blessing. I think everyone fails, but there are so many kinds of failure. Goodwill and more goodwill and more goodwill. Though I speak with the tongues of. He waited until she had done, and then said gently, "I quite see that. I suppose I ought to get off to my files now, and you will be going to bed." "I suppose so, I suppose so." They did not part for a few minutes, but the conversation had become unreal since Christianity had entered it. Ronny approved of religion as long as it endorsed the national anthem. But he objected when it attempted to influence his life. Then he would say in respectful yet decided tones, "I don't think it does to talk about these things. Every fellow has to work out his own religion," and any fellow who heard him muttered, "Here." Mrs. Moore felt that she had made a mistake in mentioning God, but she found him increasingly difficult to avoid as she grew older, and he had been constantly in her thoughts since she entered India, though oddly enough he satisfied her less. She must needs pronounce his name frequently, as the greatest she knew, yet she had never found it less efficacious. Outside the arch there seemed always an arch, beyond the remotest echo a silence. And she regretted afterwards that she had not kept to the real serious subject that had caused her to visit India, namely the relationship between Ronny and Adela. Would they, or would they not, succeed in becoming engaged to be married? End of the chapter. Now, let's listen to chapter 6. Aziz had not gone to the bridge party. Immediately after his meeting with Mrs. Moore he was diverted to other matters. Several surgical cases came in, and kept him busy. He ceased to be either outcast or poet, and became the medical student, very gay, and full of details of operations which he poured into the shrinking ears of his friends. His profession fascinated him at times, but he required it to be exciting, and it was his hand, not his mind, that was scientific. The knife he loved and used skillfully, and he also liked pumping in the latest serums. But the boredom of regime and hygiene repelled him, and after inoculating a man for enteric, he would go away and drink unfiltered water himself. "What can you expect from the fellow?" said Major Calendar. no grits, no guts. But in his heart he knew that if Aziz and not he had operated last year on Mrs. Graceford's appendix, the old lady would probably have lived. And this did not dispose him any better towards his subordinate. There was a row the morning after the mosque. They were always having rows. The major, who had been up half the night, wanted damn well to know why Aziz had not come promptly when summoned. "Sir, excuse me, I did. I mounted my bike, and it bust in front of the cow hospital. So I had to find a tonga." "Bust in front of the cow hospital, did it? And how did you come to be there?" "I beg your pardon?" Oh Lord, oh Lord. When I live here he kicked the gravel, and you live there, not 10 minutes from me, and the cow hospital is right ever so far away the other side of you, there, then how did you come to be passing the cow hospital on the way to me? Now do some work for a change." He strode away in a temper, without waiting for the excuse, which as far as it went was a sound one. The cow hospital was in a straight line between Hamidullah's house and his own, so Aziz had naturally passed it. He never realized that the educated Indians visited one another constantly, and were weaving, however painfully, a new social fabric. Caste or something of the sort would prevent them. He only knew that no one ever told him the truth, although he had been in the country for 20 years. Aziz watched him go with amusement. When his spirits were up he felt that the English are a comic institution, and he enjoyed being misunderstood by them. But it was an amusement of the emotions and nerves, which an accident or the passage of time might destroy. It was apart from the fundamental gaiety that he reached when he was with those whom he trusted. A disobliging simile involving Mrs. Calendar occurred to his fancy. "I must tell that to Mahmoud Ali, it'll make him laugh," he thought. Then he got to work. He was competent and indispensable, and he knew it. The simile passed from his mind while he exercised his professional skill. During these pleasant and busy days, he heard vaguely that the collector was giving a party, and that the Nawab Bahadur said everyone ought to go to it. His fellow assistant, Dr. Panalal, was in ecstasies at the prospect, and was urgent that they should attend it together in his new tum-tum. The arrangement suited them both. Aziz was spared the indignity of a bicycle or the expense of hiring, while Dr. Panalal, who was timid and elderly, secured someone who could manage his horse. He could manage it himself, but only just, and he was afraid of the motors and of the unknown turn into the club grounds. "Disaster may come," he said politely. "But we shall at all events get there safe, even if we do not get back. And with more logic, it will, I think, create a good impression should two doctors arrive at the same time." But when the time came, Aziz was seized with a revulsion, and determined not to go. For one thing his spell of work, lately concluded, left him independent and healthy. For another, the day chanced to fall on the anniversary of his wife's death. She had died soon after he had fallen in love with her. He had not loved her at first. Touched by Western feeling, he disliked union with a woman whom he had never seen. Moreover, when he did see her, she disappointed him, and he begat his first child in mere animality. The change began after its birth. He was won by her love for him, by a loyalty that implied something more than submission, and by her efforts to educate herself against that lifting of the purdah that would come in the next generation if not in theirs. She was intelligent, yet had old-fashioned grace. Gradually he lost the feeling that his relatives had chosen wrongly for him. Sensuous enjoyment, well, even if he had had it, it would have dulled in a year, and he had gained something instead, which seemed to increase the longer they lived together. She became the mother of a son, and in giving him a second son she died. Then he realized what he had lost, and that no woman could ever take her place. A friend would come nearer to her than another woman. She had gone, there was no one like her, and what is that uniqueness but love? He amused himself. He forgot her at times, but at other times he felt that she had sent all the beauty and joy of the world into paradise, and he meditated suicide. Would he meet her beyond the tomb? Is there such a meeting place? Though orthodox, he did not know. God's unity was indubitable and indubitably announced, but on all other points he wavered like the average Christian. His belief in the life to come would pale to a hope, vanish, reappear, all in a single sentence or a dozen heartbeats. So that the corpuscles of his blood rather than he seemed to decide which opinion he should hold, and for how long. It was so with all his opinions. Nothing stayed, nothing passed that did not return, the circulation was ceaseless and kept him young, and he mourned his wife the more sincerely because he mourned her seldom. It would have been simpler to tell Dr. Lal that he had changed his mind about the party, but until the last minute he did not know that he had changed it. Indeed, he didn't change it, it changed itself. Unconquerable aversion welled. Mrs. Calendar, Mrs. Leslie, no, he couldn't stand them in his sorrow, they would guess it, for he dowered the British matron with strange insight, and would delight in torturing him, they would mock him to their husbands. When he should have been ready, he stood at the post office, writing a telegram to his children, and found on his return that Dr. Lal had called for him, and gone on. Well, let him go on, as befitted the coarseness of his nature. For his own part, he would commune with the dead. And unlocking a drawer, he took out his wife's photograph. He gazed at it, and tears spouted from his eyes. He thought, how unhappy I am. But because he really was unhappy, another emotion soon mingled with his self-pity. He desired to remember his wife and could not. Why could he remember people whom he did not love? They were always so vivid to him, whereas the more he looked at this photograph, the less he saw. She had eluded him thus, ever since they had carried her to her tomb. He had known that she would pass from his hands and eyes, but had thought she could live in his mind, not realizing that the very fact that we have loved the dead increases their unreality, and that the more passionately we invoke them the further they recede. A piece of brown cardboard and 3 children, that was all that was left of his wife. It was unbearable, and he thought again. How unhappy I am. And became happier. He had breathed for an instant the mortal air that surrounds Orientals and all men, and he drew back from it with a gasp, for he was young. Never, never shall I get over this, he told himself. Most certainly my career is a failure, and my sons will be badly brought up. Since it was certain, he strove to avert it, and looked at some notes he had made on a case at the hospital. Perhaps someday a rich person might require this particular operation, and he gain a large sum. The notes interesting him on their own account. He locked the photograph up again. Its moment was over, and he did not think about his wife any more. After tea his spirits improved, and he went round to see Hamidullah. Hamidullah had gone to the party, but his pony had not, so Aziz borrowed it, also his friend's riding breeches and polo mallet. He repaired to the Maidan. It was deserted except at its rim, where some bazaar youths were training. Training for what? They would have found it hard to say, but the word had got into the air. Round they ran, weedy and knock-kneed. The local physique was wretched, with an expression on their faces not so much of determination as of a determination to be determined. Maharaja, Salam, he called for a joke. The youths stopped and laughed. He advised them not to exert themselves. They promised they would not, and ran on. Riding into the middle, he began to knock the ball about. He could not play, but his pony could, and he set himself to learn, free from all human tension. He forgot the whole damned business of living as he scurried over the brown platter of the Maidan, with the evening wind on his forehead, and the encircling trees soothing his eyes. The ball shot away towards a stray subaltern who was also practicing. He hit it back to Aziz and called, "Send it along again." All right. The newcomer had some notion of what to do, but his horse had none, and forces were equal. Concentrated on the ball, they somehow became fond of one another, and smiled when they drew rein to rest. Aziz liked soldiers. They either accepted you or swore at you, which was preferable to the civilian's auteur, and the subaltern liked anyone who could ride. "Often play?" he asked. "Never." "Let's have another chukker." As he hit, his horse bucked and off he went, cried, "Oh God!" and jumped on again. "Don't you ever fall off?" "Plenty." "Not you." They reined up again, the fire of good fellowship in their eyes. but it cooled with their bodies, for athletics can only raise a temporary glow. Nationality was returning, but before it could exert its poison they parted, saluting each other. If only they were all like that, each thought. Now it was sunset. A few of his co-religionists had come to the Maidan, and were praying with their faces towards Mecca. A Brahmani bull walked towards them, and Aziz, though disinclined to pray himself, did not see why they should be bothered with the clumsy and idolatrous animal. He gave it a tap with his bolo mallet. As he did so, a voice from the road hailed him. It was Dr. Panalal, returning in high distress from the collector's party. Dr. Aziz, where you been? I waited 10 full minutes time at your house, then I went. I am so awfully sorry, I was compelled to go to the post office. One of his own circle would have accepted this as meaning that he had changed his mind, an event too common to merit censure. But Dr. Lal, being of low extraction, was not sure whether an insult had not been intended. And he was further annoyed because Aziz had buffeted the Brahmani bull. Post office? Do you not send your servants? He said. I have so few, my scale is very small. Your servant spoke to me. I saw your servant. But, Dr. Lal, consider. How could I send my servant when you were coming? You come, we go, my house is left alone, my servant comes back perhaps, and all my portable property has been carried away by bad characters in the meantime. Would you have that? The cook is deaf, I can never count on my cook, and the boy is only a little boy. Never do I and Hassan leave the house at the same time together. It is my fixed rule. He said all this and much more out of civility, to save Dr. Lal's face. It was not offered as truth and should not have been criticized as such. But the other demolished it, an easy and ignoble task. Even if this so, what prevents leaving a chit saying where you go? And so on. Aziz detested ill-breeding, and made his pony caper. Farther away, or mine will start out of sympathy, he wailed, revealing the true source of his irritation. It has been so rough and wild this afternoon. It spoiled some most valuable blossoms in the club garden, and had to be dragged back by 4 men. English ladies and gentlemen looking on, and the collector sahib himself taking a note. But, Dr. Aziz, I'll not take up your valuable time. This will not interest you, who have so many engagements and telegrams. I am just a poor old doctor who thought right to pay my respects when I was asked and where I was asked. Your absence, I may remark, drew commentaries. They can damn well comment. It is fine to be young. Damn well. Oh, very fine. Damn whom? I go or not as I please. Yet you promise me, and then fabricate this tale of a telegram. Go forward, Dapple. They went, and Aziz had a wild desire to make an enemy for life. He could do it so easily by galloping near them. He did it. Dapple bolted. He thundered back onto the Maidan. The glory of his play with the subaltern remained for a little. He galloped and swooped till he poured with sweat, and until he returned the pony to Hamidullah's stable he felt the equal of any man. Once on his feet, he had creeping fears. Was he in bad odor with the powers that be? Had he offended the collector by absenting himself? Dr. Panalal was a person of no importance, yet was it wise to have quarrelled even with him? The complexion of his mind turned from human to political. He thought no longer, can I get on with people? But are they stronger than I? Breathing the prevalent miasma. At his home a chit was awaiting him, bearing the government stamp. It lay on his table like a high explosive, which at a touch might blow his flimsy bungalow to bits. He was going to be cashiered because he had not turned up at the party. When he opened the note, it proved to be quite different, an invitation from Mr. Fielding, the principal of Government College, asking him to come to tea the day after tomorrow. His spirits revived with violence. They would have revived in any case, for he possessed a soul that could suffer but not stifle, and led a steady life beneath his mutability. But this invitation gave him particular joy, because Fielding had asked him to tea a month ago, and he had forgotten about it, never answered, never gone, just forgotten. And here came a second invitation, without a rebuke or even an allusion to his slip. Here was true courtesy, the civil deed that shows the good heart. And snatching up his pen he wrote an affectionate reply. And hurried back for news to Hamidullas. For he had never met the principal, and believed that the one serious gap in his life was going to be filled. He longed to know everything about the splendid fellow. His salary, preferences, antecedents, how best one might please him. But Hamidullah was still out, and Mahmoud Ali, who was in, would only make silly rude jokes about the party. End of the chapter. Thank you. Thank you.